In 1953, an Italian widow in Brooklyn named Rosa fed 7 children on $4 a week. Her secret was Sunday dinner, a single pot that stretched into Monday, Tuesday, and sometimes Wednesday. Number 9 on this list was the meal her grandmother brought over from Naples on a steamer in 1908. Number 3 contains an ingredient that cost less than a nickel and built more Italian-American families than any pasta company ever sold. Number 1 was so humble that Italian grandmothers across the Bronx, Hoboken, and South Philadelphia served it more often than spaghetti and meatballs. These 30 Sunday dinners fed a generation through the lean post-war years, then quietly disappeared when families could afford the prettier versions on restaurant menus. Hit that subscribe button. Let us count down the 30 forgotten poor man. Italian Sunday dinners no one makes anymore. Number 30. Pasta e lenticchie. In the basement kitchens of Italian South Philadelphia in 1954, a pot of dried brown lentils, an onion, a clove of garlic, and a handful of broken spaghetti could feed a family of 8 for under 30 cents. The lentils simmered slowly with a bay leaf and a piece of celery until they softened into something between a soup and a stew. The pasta went in last, cooked right in the lentil broth so every strand absorbed the earthy flavor. A drizzle of olive oil at the table and a heavy crank of black pepper finished it. That was Sunday supper. There was no meat in it. There did not need to be. The lentils gave 15 grams of protein per serving, and the broken pasta turned the bowl into something a working man could eat and walk back to the steel mill on Monday morning. Number 29. Pasta mollica. Pasta mollica was the Sunday dinner you made when there was no money for cheese. Stale bread from earlier in the week was ground rough into crumbs, then toasted in a skillet with olive oil and a clove of garlic until the crumbs turned the color of dark honey. The crumbs were spooned over a pound of cooked spaghetti, tossed with anchovy paste and red pepper flakes. The toasted bread coated every strand the way Parmigiano would have. The texture was extraordinary, crunchy, savory, deeply garlicky. Italian immigrants from Sicily and Calabria brought this technique with them in the 1890s. By the 1950s, you could find it on Sunday tables across Boston's North End and Newark's Ironbound. A loaf of stale bread cost 2 cents. A box of spaghetti cost a dime. This was Sunday dinner for less than a quarter. Number 28. Frittata di pasta. Nothing went into the trash in an Italian household, especially not leftover Sunday pasta. Monday afternoon, the cold spaghetti from yesterday's gravy went into a bowl with 4 beaten eggs, a handful of grated cheese if there was any, and a pinch of salt. The whole mixture got poured into a hot oiled skillet and cooked low until the bottom set into a golden crust. Then a plate went over the top, and the whole thing got flipped to cook the other side. What came out was a thick golden pancake of pasta and egg, sliced into wedges like a pie. It was crispy outside, tender inside, and tasted nothing like the original pasta. Children fought over the crusty edges. Mothers in Bay Ridge served it cold the next day in sandwiches between 2 slices of crusty bread, wrapped in wax paper and tucked into the lunch pails of men heading to the Brooklyn Navy Yard. One pot of leftover spaghetti fed 2 more meals this way. The frittata di pasta was not a desperation meal. It was a beloved one. A dozen eggs cost 40 cents in 1955. Leftover pasta was free. The whole meal fed 6 people for less than 15 cents. Number 27. Pancotto is what Italian grandmothers made when there was nothing left in the house except old bread and garlic. Stale crusts and torn slices went into a pot of boiling water with 3 garlic cloves, a bay leaf, and salt. The bread dissolved over 20 minutes, turning the whole pot thick and creamy, without a drop of cream. At the end, an egg was beaten in to enrich it, and olive oil was drizzled over the top. That was Sunday supper for some families, just bread, water, garlic, and oil. In Puglia, where most of these families came from, pancotto was eaten by farmers for centuries before they ever saw America. It was the cheapest hot meal a human being could put in front of a child, and Italian mothers in Brooklyn made it without shame because they knew exactly what it was for. A loaf of stale bread cost 2 cents. The whole pot came to about a nickel, and it filled stomachs the same way a steak would have. Pancotto translates literally as cooked bread, which is exactly what it is, just bread transformed by water, time, and the steady hand of a woman who knew how to feed children on nothing. Number 26, pasta with cauliflower. A whole head of cauliflower cost about 12 cents at the Arthur Avenue Market in 1955. Italian mothers broke it into small florets and sautéed them in olive oil with garlic and a generous pinch of red pepper flakes until the edges caramelized and the cauliflower turned almost sweet. A splash of pasta water and a can of crushed tomatoes turned the whole thing into a sauce. Tossed with rigatoni or penne and finished with toasted breadcrumbs, this was a Sunday dinner that fed 6 people with no meat and almost no money. The cauliflower took on the deep flavor of the garlicky oil. The pasta carried it everywhere. Sicilians added raisins and pine nuts when they could afford them. The cauliflower had to be cooked until it almost fell apart. That was the secret. The texture became something between a vegetable and a paste, coating every piece of pasta with caramelized sweetness. A handful of toasted breadcrumbs on top added crunch and replaced cheese for families that could not afford Parmigiano. The whole pot cost less than 25 cents. Today, restaurants charge $20 for a fancy version. Your grandmother charged nothing. Number 25, escarole and beans. In a Brooklyn tenement in 1956, a head of escarole cost a nickel and a can of cannellini beans cost 12 cents. Together, they made a Sunday supper that tasted like Naples itself. The escarole was washed 3 times to get the grit out, then sautéed in olive oil with garlic and a tiny anchovy that dissolved into the oil. The beans went in with their canning liquid, and everything simmered until the escarole turned silky and the beans soaked up the garlicky broth. Served in shallow bowls with grilled stale bread rubbed with raw garlic, this was complete nutrition for 40 cents. The anchovy was the secret. It dissolved completely in the hot oil, leaving no fishy taste, only a deep, savory richness that elevated the entire pot. The bitter edge of the green was tamed by the long cooking and balanced by the buttery sweetness of the white beans. Italian-American grandmothers fed this to grandchildren who had colds, to husbands coming off long shifts at the factory, to neighbors who showed up at the door empty-handed and hungry. On Sunday, the mothers added a pinch of grated cheese on top, and that was enough to make it feel like a holiday. Number 24, Italian stuffed peppers. The Italian version was different from anything you would find in a Midwest farmhouse. Green bell peppers were halved and cleaned, then filled with a mixture of day-old Italian bread soaked in milk, 2 cloves of garlic, grated pecorino cheese, fresh parsley, a beaten egg, and just a small amount of ground meat to bind it. The peppers were baked in a pan with tomato sauce in the bottom, the steam softening them as they cooked. The filling browned on top and stayed soft and almost custardy underneath. A pound of green peppers cost about 15 cents at a curbside market. Italian mothers stretched 4 ounces of beef into 6 servings using bread and cheese, and no one ever felt cheated by it. The bread soaked in milk was the foundation of the filling. American versions use raw rice, which makes the filling dense and heavy. Italian versions used soaked bread, which kept the filling fluffy and almost mousse-like. Children who refused to eat plain bell peppers ate these without complaint because the filling was so good. Number 23. Polenta with red sauce. Long before polenta became a $15 appetizer at Italian restaurants, it was the survival food of northern Italian immigrants in the coal mining towns of western Pennsylvania. A pound of cornmeal cost 8 cents in 1953 and could feed 8 people. Mothers poured the cornmeal slowly into boiling salted water, stirring constantly for 40 minutes until it turned thick enough to hold a spoon upright. Then it got poured onto a wooden board, smoothed flat, and topped with whatever red sauce was on the stove. Sometimes there were meatballs, often there were not. The whole board sat in the middle of the table, and the family ate directly from it with forks. Children remember the polenta board as the most communal meal of their childhood. Nobody had their own plate. Everybody ate from the same surface. The board itself was passed down from grandmother to mother to daughter, a thick slab of unfinished pine that had absorbed decades of polenta and tomato sauce. Northern Italian immigrants from the Veneto, Friuli, and Piedmont brought this tradition with them when they came to work the coal mines of Pennsylvania and the steel mills of Ohio. By the end of the meal, the board was clean and the family was full. Number 22. Stracciatella. This was the Sunday soup that mothers made when somebody was sick, or the weather turned bad, or there simply was no money to buy meat for dinner. A pot of chicken broth, made from the bones of last Sunday's roast, was brought to a hard simmer. Then 2 eggs, beaten with a half cup of grated Parmigiano Reggiano and a handful of fresh parsley, were poured into the broth in a thin stream while stirring fast. The eggs set instantly into delicate, ragged strands that floated through the soup like little ribbons. The cheese melted into the broth, thickening it slightly and adding a salty richness that turned plain water and bone broth into something restorative. Italian mothers never threw away a bone. They saved them in a paper bag in the icebox, building toward a Saturday afternoon when they could simmer them into something nourishing. Italian grandmothers fed this to grandchildren with fevers and to women recovering from childbirth. It tasted like care made liquid. Number 21. Pasta e piselli. A can of peas cost 10 cents at the corner grocery in 1954. A box of ditalini pasta cost 9 cents. Together with an onion, a clove of garlic, and a tablespoon of tomato paste, they made the Sunday dinner that Italian mothers all over Astoria and Williamsburg made when the meat budget had run out. The onion sautéed slow in olive oil until it turned translucent and started to caramelize at the edges. The tomato paste went in to caramelize alongside it, deepening into something almost brick red. Then the peas, with all their canning liquid and enough water to make a soupy sauce. The ditalini cooked right in the pot, absorbing everything as it softened. A pinch of grated cheese on top, and that was supper. 25 cents total, 6 servings. The genius of pasta e piselli was in the way the starch from the pasta thickened the broth as it cooked. By the time the ditalini was tender, the whole pot had turned into something between a soup and a stew. Italian mothers in working-class Queens neighborhoods made this on Tuesdays when payday was Friday and the wallet was empty. Children remember pasta e piselli as one of the foods that defined their childhood. First pattern break. Here is where it gets interesting. Italian Sunday dinner in the 1950s was not what the movies showed you. There were no long tables groaning under meatballs and bracioli and lasagna all at once. That feast existed for the families who had made it in America, the ones who had moved out of the tenements and into the row houses in New Jersey or out to the suburbs on Long Island. For the families still climbing, Sunday dinner was a pot of beans and pasta, a skillet of leftover spaghetti turned into eggs, a piece of stale bread soaked in tomato. The Sunday gravy television celebrates was an aspirational thing. Most Italian working-class families ate it once or twice a year on real holidays. They ate them on Sunday because Sunday was supposed to be different. And the difference was not abundance. The difference was that mother was home, the family ate together, and the meal was made with care even when it cost a quarter. Number 20. Tripe alla Romana. This is the dish that separated Italian immigrants from their American neighbors. Tripe, honeycomb tripe, the cleaned stomach lining of a cow, cost 20 cents a pound at Italian butchers in the 1950s. Most Americans would not touch it. Italian families made it on Sunday. The tripe was washed several times with vinegar, then simmered for 2 hours with onions, garlic, and tomato sauce until it turned tender and absorbed every bit of flavor in the pot. Mint and a heavy grating of pecorino cheese went over the top. Served with crusty bread for sopping the sauce, this was a complete Sunday dinner for 30 cents. The mint was the secret no other tripe recipe used. It cut through the richness of the offal and brightened the heavy tomato sauce in a way that made the dish unmistakably Roman. The long simmer broke down the connective tissue and turned the tripe meltingly tender. Children who grew up eating this on Sunday afternoons did not flinch at the idea of tripe. They simply ate it. It was Sunday dinner. Number 19. Pasta con la sarde. Sicilians brought this with them in their suitcases, and they refused to give it up no matter how strange it looked to their American neighbors. Wild fennel, when they could find it, or fennel bulb when they could not, was sautéed with onions in olive oil. Then a can of sardines packed in oil was mashed right into the pan, along with raisins, pine nuts, and a pinch of saffron if it was a real splurge. The whole thing was tossed with bucatini and topped with toasted breadcrumbs. The combination sounds wrong. The taste is unforgettable. Sweet from the raisins, salty from the fish, fragrant from the fennel, crunchy from the bread. A can of sardines was 11 cents in 1955. The pasta was a dime. Sicilian immigrants searched for years for wild fennel in American parks and vacant lots, sometimes finding it growing along the train tracks in Brooklyn. The breadcrumbs on top took the place of cheese, since Sicilian tradition forbids cheese on any seafood pasta. This was Sunday dinner for a Sicilian family in Bensonhurst, and it tasted exactly like home. Take a whole head of escarole. Blanch it briefly to soften it, then open the leaves like a flower. Stuff the center with breadcrumbs, garlic, anchovies, capers, raisins, pine nuts, and grated cheese. Tie it closed with kitchen string and braise slowly in olive oil and white wine until the escarole turns tender and the filling sets. Slice it into rings and serve with the pan juices. This was the Sunday dinner of Italian families in Providence and Boston's North End. The escarole itself, costing only a nickel, was the star. The stuffing turned a bitter green into something complex and savory enough to be the centerpiece of a Sunday table. The technique was passed from mother to daughter without ever being written down. The wine in the braising liquid reduced into something almost syrupy by the end of cooking, coating the outside of the escarole bundle with a sweet, savory glaze. It cost a quarter to make. It fed 6 people, and it had nearly disappeared from Italian-American kitchens by 1975. Number 17. Baccalà. Every Italian-American kitchen had a piece of baccalà hanging from a string in the pantry or soaking in a bowl of water on the counter from Friday to Sunday. Salt cod cost about 30 cents a pound in 1956 and lasted indefinitely. You changed the water 3 times over 2 days to draw out the salt, and what came out was a firm, white piece of fish that tasted like the Mediterranean. Italian mothers braised it with tomatoes, olives, capers, and potatoes for Sunday dinner. Sicilian families served it with fried polenta. Neapolitan families served it over crusty bread. By the time Italian immigrants arrived in America, bacala was woven into the religious calendar. Catholic families ate fish on Fridays and during Lent, and bacala was the cheapest fish available year-round. On Christmas Eve, it was the centerpiece of the Feast of the Seven Fishes for families who could not afford fresh seafood. Italian-American children grew up eating bacala and never thought it was strange. It was the taste of every generation that had come before. Number 16. Chicken livers and onions. Chicken livers cost 10 cents a pound at the butcher in 1955 because most Americans threw them away. Italian families saved them. On Sunday afternoon, a pound of livers was rinsed, patted dry, and tossed in flour. They went into a hot skillet with olive oil and butter, browning fast on the outside while staying pink and creamy on the inside. 2 yellow onions had already been caramelized in another pan until they were soft and sweet. The livers and onions came together at the end with a splash of red wine. Served over polenta or crusty bread, this was Sunday dinner for under $1. Italian mothers knew that chicken livers had to be cooked fast and hot, leaving the centers slightly pink. Overcooked livers turned grainy and bitter. Italian grandmothers fed them to children recovering from illness, to women who looked pale and tired, to husbands coming home from long shifts at the factory. The dish was a kind of medicine that tasted like a feast. Number 15. Wedding soup. Wedding soup has nothing to do with weddings. The Italian name minestra maritata means married soup, referring to the marriage of meats and greens in the pot. Chicken broth from yesterday's bones, tiny meatballs the size of a marble, made from a quarter pound of ground beef stretched with bread and egg. A bunch of escarole or kale, torn small. A handful of orzo or pastina. Everything simmered together until the meatballs cooked through and the greens went silky. A heavy grating of pecorino on top. A pot fed 8 people for under 50 cents. Today it appears on restaurant menus at $15 a bowl. The meatballs were the part that took time. Italian mothers rolled them between their palms, making each one no larger than a marble. The size mattered. Tiny meatballs cooked through in minutes and stayed tender, while a small amount of meat felt like an abundance when scattered through the soup. The name refers to the marriage of flavors in the pot, the way the meat and the greens come together to make something neither could be alone. Number 14. Pasta with anchovies and garlic. The Sunday meal that Italian fishermen in San Francisco's North Beach made when there was no fresh fish to bring home. A small can of flat anchovies cost 6 cents. A box of spaghetti was a dime. Olive oil and garlic completed the entire ingredient list. The anchovies dissolved in hot oil with the garlic, melting into a salty, briny base that coated every strand of pasta. A handful of toasted breadcrumbs finished it. The result was so deeply flavored that anyone tasting it for the first time would never guess the entire meal cost less than 20 cents. The anchovies had to dissolve completely in the oil. Italian cooks knew to crush them with the back of a wooden spoon while they melted. The garlic had to be golden, but never browned. The breadcrumbs on top replaced cheese, which Sicilian and Neapolitan tradition prohibited on seafood pasta. Italian-American families in coastal cities like San Francisco, Boston, and New Orleans made this dish whenever the fresh catch had failed. Number 13. Minestrone. The real minestrone was not a recipe, it was a method. Whatever vegetables were starting to turn in the icebox went into a pot of water with a piece of stale Parmesan rind saved specifically for this purpose. Onions, celery, carrots, cabbage, zucchini, beans, potatoes, tomatoes. Whatever was there. A handful of broken pasta or a cup of rice went in at the end to thicken everything up. 2 hours on low and the whole house smelled like an Italian kitchen on a Sunday afternoon. The Parmesan rind gave it depth that no other ingredient could replicate. Italian mothers never wasted a cheese rind. A pot of minestrone cost 40 cents and fed a family for 2 days. Every Italian household kept a collection of cheese rinds in the icebox, accumulating them over weeks until enough had built up to flavor a soup. Italian-American grandmothers made minestrone every week, sometimes twice a week, year-round. Modern canned minestrone in American supermarkets bears no resemblance to the real thing. The depth is missing. The cheese rind is missing. The love is missing. Number 12. Sausage and peppers the real way. Forget what they sell at street festivals. The real Italian-American Sunday version was made with 2 pounds of frying peppers, 1 yellow onion, and just half a pound of sweet Italian sausage cut into small pieces. The sausage browned first, releasing its fat into the pan. Then the peppers and onions went in to slow cook in that flavored oil for 45 minutes until everything turned soft and sweet and the peppers melted into the onions. The sausage flavor permeated everything. The result was 3 or 4 servings of vegetables for every serving of meat. Italian mothers served it over rigatoni, over polenta, or with crusty bread for soaking. A pound of frying peppers cost 12 cents. Half a pound of sausage was 30 cents. This was Sunday dinner for 50 cents that fed 6 people. Most Americans got the meat to vegetable ratio backwards. The Italian frying pepper, called the cubanelle or the Italian long pepper, was the variety that mattered. These long, pale green peppers were sweeter and more delicate than bell peppers, and they cooked down into something silky and almost jam-like when sautéed slowly. Italian markets in every neighborhood sold them by the pound, cheap and abundant from June through October. Italian mothers bought 10 pounds at a time and made the dish weekly through the summer and fall. The slow cook was the key. Most American cooks throw peppers in a hot pan and stir-fry them. Italian cooks let them sit in the rendered sausage fat over low heat for 45 minutes, sometimes an hour, stirring only occasionally. The peppers slowly collapsed, releasing their water, then caramelizing in the fat. The onions did the same. The sausage pieces, having been browned at the start, sat among the vegetables and shared their flavor without dominating. By the time the dish was finished, it was no longer about the sausage. It was about the peppers and onions, sweetened by long cooking, perfumed by pork fat, transformed into something almost like a savory marmalade. Served over pasta, the vegetable mixture coated the noodles. Served over polenta, it sank into the corn and gave it new life. Served with crusty bread, it became a sandwich that could feed a working man through a long afternoon. The dish has been bastardized at street fairs across America, where vendors loaded up with cheap sausage and bell peppers cooked too fast, missing the point entirely. The real version was a slow Sunday meal that used peppers as the main event and sausage as the seasoning. Second, pattern break. Here is what nobody tells you about Italian-American Sunday cooking. Italian mothers in the 1950s practiced something modern nutrition science has only recently caught up to. They built meals around vegetables and beans and bread, with meat used as a flavoring rather than a centerpiece. Half a pound of sausage stretched to feed 6 because it was buried in 2 pounds of peppers. A handful of meatballs floated through a pot of greens and pasta. A single anchovy dissolved into a quart of olive oil. Researchers studying the Mediterranean diet now confirm this ratio of plants to animal protein is exactly what protects against heart disease, diabetes, and cancer. Italian mothers in Brooklyn did not know this. They cooked this way because meat cost too much. It kept their families healthy by accident, and that accident became one of the great gifts of Italian-American culture. The grandchildren of these mothers, eating cheeseburgers and frozen dinners in the 70s and 80s, lost something they did not even know they had. Heart disease rates climbed, diabetes climbed, obesity climbed. The first generation of Italian Americans eating pasta e fagioli and escarole and beans and stuffed peppers lived long lives. The third generation, eating fast food and processed meat, did not. The lesson of the Italian-American Sunday table was that the cheapest food, made well, was also the healthiest food. We forgot. The world's leading nutritionists now write books trying to teach us what our great-grandmothers knew without thinking. Eat your beans, eat your greens, eat your olive oil, use meat sparingly, cook from scratch, eat together. The instructions are not new. They are written into every recipe on this list, in the hand of a woman who never wrote them down and never needed to. Number 11. Eggplant Parmesan. The original 1950s version was nothing like what you get in a restaurant today. 2 eggplants cost a dime at an Italian fruit stand. Mothers sliced them thin, salted them to draw out the bitterness, and let them drain for an hour. Then they dredged the slices in flour and egg and fried them in olive oil until golden. Layered in a casserole dish with simple tomato sauce, a sprinkle of grated Parmigiano, and very little mozzarella because mozzarella was expensive, the dish baked for half an hour. The result was tender, garlicky, and substantial enough to be the entire Sunday meal. Modern restaurants drown eggplant parm in mozzarella and skip the proper frying. The 1950s version used cheese as a seasoning, not the main event. The EGG plant was the star. A meal for 6 cost 30 cents. The leftovers were better cold the next day. The salting was the step that everyone now skips. Modern cooks rush the process, slicing eggplant and going straight to frying. Italian mothers in the 1950s knew better. They salted the slices and laid them out on towels to draw out the bitter liquid that gave eggplant its bad reputation. After an hour, they patted the slices dry and proceeded with the recipe. The result was an eggplant that tasted sweet and meaty, with none of the bitterness that ruined the dish for so many Americans. The frying was done in pure olive oil, hot enough to crisp the outside of each slice while keeping the inside tender. Dredging in flour and egg created a coating that absorbed the oil and turned golden brown, almost like a thin schnitzel. When the slices were layered with sauce in a casserole, the coating softened slightly and merged with the sauce, becoming part of the dish rather than a separate element. The cheese was used sparingly, a handful of Parmigiano grated over each layer, a small amount of mozzarella scattered on top. The point was the EGG plant, not the cheese. Italian-American grandmothers from Calabria and Puglia made this every other Sunday in summer when eggplants were cheap and abundant. The whole house smelled like frying olive oil and garlic. The dish came out of the oven, bubbling and golden, the slices of eggplant tender enough to cut with the side of a fork. Modern Italian restaurants have turned eggplant parmesan into a cheese-heavy gut bomb that bears almost no resemblance to the original. The real version was lighter, more delicate, more honest. It tasted like vegetables, not like dairy. Number 10. Pasta e patati. This dish confuses Americans because it sounds wrong. Pasta and potatoes in the same dish? Yes, and it works. Italian mothers from Naples brought this with them. They made it on Sundays when meat was beyond reach. 2 potatoes diced small, an onion, a tablespoon of tomato paste, and a couple of pancetta scraps if they were available. Everything sautéed in olive oil until the potatoes started to soften. Then water and broken pasta of mixed shapes went in, cooking together until the starch from the potatoes and the pasta thickened the broth into something almost creamy. A grating of cheese on top finished it. This was Sunday dinner for working-class Italian families in Hoboken and Newark, feeding 7 people for under 30 cents. The combination of carbs sounds excessive. The reality is one of the most satisfying meals ever invented. The mixed pasta shapes were the giveaway. Italian families never threw away the broken pieces from the bottom of pasta boxes. They saved them in a jar, accumulating broken ziti, fragments of spaghetti, ends of penne, half pieces of rigatoni. When the jar was full, it went into a pasta e patate. The mixed shapes cooked at different rates, some pieces tender and some still slightly firm, creating a texture that no single pasta shape could achieve. The potatoes, diced small, broke down partially during cooking, releasing starch that thickened the broth into something between a soup and a sauce. The pancetta, when available, added smoky depth, but the dish worked perfectly well without it. The tomato paste caramelized in the early stages of cooking, adding color and umami. Italian-American grandmothers from Naples made this every week, sometimes more than once. It was a way to use up the broken pasta pieces, the potatoes that had been in the bin too long, the bit of pancetta left in the icebox. Nothing was wasted. Everything went into the pot. The result was a dish that tasted infinitely more complex than its humble ingredients suggested. Children who grew up eating pasta e patate remember it as one of their favorite meals, a creamy, rich, deeply satisfying bowl that warmed them from the inside on cold winter evenings. The Neapolitan tradition holds that pasta e patate must be eaten with a spoon, not a fork, because the consistency is closer to soup than to pasta. Italian-American families in Newark and Hoboken kept the tradition. They served it in deep bowls, with crusty bread on the side and a sprinkling of pecorino on top. The whole meal cost almost nothing and felt like a celebration. Number 9. Stuffed artichokes. This is the meal Rosa's grandmother brought over from Naples on a steamer in 1908, and it defined Sunday in Italian-American homes for the better part of a century. A whole globe artichoke, leaves spread open like a flower, stuffed with seasoned breadcrumbs, garlic, parsley, and grated cheese pressed deep between every leaf. Then it was placed upright in a pot with an inch of water and olive oil at the bottom, covered and steamed slowly for an hour until the leaves pulled away easily and the heart turned tender. You ate it leaf by leaf, scraping the soft flesh and breadcrumb mixture off with your teeth. The heart at the bottom was the prize. Artichokes cost 15 cents each at curbside Italian markets in 1954. 1 artichoke per person. The whole meal cost $1 and lasted an hour at the table because eating an artichoke is slow, deliberate work. It made every Sunday feel ceremonial. The preparation was the labor of love. Each artichoke had to be trimmed, the tough outer leaves pulled off, the thorny tips of the remaining leaves snipped with kitchen scissors. The stem was cut flat so the artichoke could stand upright. Then, the leaves had to be spread open, one at a time, like the petals of a flower, while the seasoned breadcrumb mixture was pushed deep into every crevice. The work took 20 minutes per artichoke. A family of 6 required 2 hours of preparation just for the appetizer. Italian mothers did this on Sunday morning, sometimes while still in their housecoats, methodically working through a pile of artichokes that had been bought at the Saturday market. The seasoning of the breadcrumbs was specific: garlic, parsley, grated pecorino, salt, pepper, and a generous glug of olive oil to bind everything together. Some families added anchovies, some added capers, some added a pinch of red pepper flakes. The basic mixture was the same in every Italian kitchen. When the artichokes finally hit the pot, they steamed slowly, the breadcrumbs absorbing the moisture and the artichoke flavor while the leaves softened to tenderness. The water at the bottom of the pot, infused with olive oil and the juices from the artichokes, became a kind of dipping sauce for the breadcrumbs that fell off during eating. The ritual of eating a stuffed artichoke was the meal itself. Each leaf had to be pulled off, the tender flesh and breadcrumb mixture scraped off with the teeth, the spent leaf discarded onto a separate plate. The process was slow. It forced everyone at the table to talk, to linger, to be present with each other. By the time you reached the heart, an hour had passed. The conversation had moved through 3 topics. The wine was half gone. The artichoke had done its job. It had turned dinner into a Sunday afternoon. Number 8. Braciole. The cheap cut nobody else wanted was top round, sliced thin and pounded thinner. Italian butchers in Brooklyn would do the pounding for free. Mothers spread the thin sheets of beef with a mixture of breadcrumbs, garlic, parsley, pine nuts, and grated cheese, then rolled them up tight and tied them with kitchen string. The braciole went into a pot of simmering tomato sauce for 3 hours until they turned fork tender. The breadcrumbs absorbed the meat juices and the sauce. The whole thing emerged as something that tasted 10 times richer than the price suggested. A pound of top round was 40 cents in 1955. The breadcrumbs and seasonings were free. 1 pot of braciole and sauce fed 8 people on Sunday and provided pasta sauce for Monday and Tuesday. This was how Italian mothers made cheap beef taste like Sunday at the Vatican. The technique came from southern Italy, where braciole had been a Sunday tradition for centuries. The thin slices of beef were a way to make a small amount of meat feel like an abundance. A pound of top round, sliced into 8 thin sheets, became 8 individual braciole that each looked substantial on the plate. The stuffing inside, dense with breadcrumbs and cheese, doubled the volume of each roll. When sliced open at the table, the spiral of stuffed beef looked elegant and complex, like a dish that had taken serious skill. The reality was that the technique was simple enough for any Italian housewife to master. The pounding flattened the meat to uniform thinness. The filling was spread evenly. The roll was tied with cotton kitchen string in 3 or 4 places to hold its shape during cooking. The braciole was then browned briefly in olive oil to develop flavor before being dropped into a pot of tomato sauce to braise for 3 hours. The long cook was essential. Top round, a tough cut from the hind leg of the cow, required extended braising to break down its connective tissue and turn tender. By the end of 3 hours, the braciole was fork tender, the filling had melded with the meat, and the tomato sauce had absorbed all the deep, meaty flavors of the beef and the cheese. When Italian mothers cut the kitchen string and sliced the braciole into rounds, the spiral filling was revealed. Each round was a small work of art, a piece of beef wrapped around a savory filling, sitting in a pool of rich tomato sauce, ready to be served over pasta. Italian-American children remember Sunday braciole as the special meal, the one that announced that the family was eating well that week. The smell of it simmering all afternoon filled the apartment with anticipation. By the time dinner was served, everyone was ravenous, and the dish lived up to the wait. Number 7. Chicken cacciatore. Cacciatore means hunter style, and the dish was named because it was made with whatever the hunter brought home. In Italian-American kitchens, that meant the cheapest cuts of chicken, usually whole cut-up birds with the back and wings included. A 4-pound chicken cost $1.50 in 1955. Mothers browned the pieces in olive oil, then simmered them slowly with onions, garlic, bell peppers, mushrooms if affordable, and a can of crushed tomatoes for nearly 2 hours. The chicken fell off the bone. The sauce reduced into something thick and intensely savory. Served over pasta or polenta with crusty bread, this was Sunday dinner for a family of 7 for under $2. Every part of the chicken was used. The neck and back made tomorrow's broth. Nothing was wasted. This was the meal that filled Italian-American homes with a smell that lasted 3 days. The browning of the chicken was the step that built the foundation of flavor. Italian mothers dredged each piece in seasoned flour, then browned them hard in olive oil until the skin was deep golden and crisp. The fond left in the bottom of the pan, the caramelized bits stuck to the surface, was the most precious ingredient in the dish. When the onions and garlic and peppers went in, they scraped up that fond and incorporated it into the sauce. The tomatoes deglazed the pan further, pulling every last bit of flavor off the bottom. By the time the chicken pieces went back in to braise, the sauce was already deep and complex. The long simmer did the rest. 2 hours of gentle bubbling broke down the chicken, infused the sauce with poultry richness, and reduced everything into a thick, glossy sauce that coated the meat. The peppers turned silky. The onions melted into the sauce. The mushrooms, when affordable, added an earthy depth. Italian families from different regions had different versions of cacciatore. The Tuscan version used red wine. The Roman version added rosemary. The Neapolitan version was heavier on the tomatoes and lighter on the herbs. American Italian families adapted to what they had, but the principle was always the same: cheap chicken, slow cooking, a rich tomato-based sauce, and enough vegetables to stretch a single bird into 7 generous portions. The leftovers were better the next day, when the flavors had merged completely. Italian-American grandmothers made cacciatore every other Sunday throughout the year. It was a dish that survived as immigrants assimilated, partly because it adapted easily to American supermarket chicken, and partly because it tasted so good. But the original version, made with the cheapest cuts and stretched with peppers and onions, has largely vanished. Modern recipes call for boneless chicken thighs and expensive wild mushrooms. The original called for whatever the hunter brought home and made magic from it. Number 6. Italian stuffed cabbage. Cabbage was the cheapest vegetable at the curbside market. A head cost 6 cents in 1956. The Italian version of stuffed cabbage was different from the Polish or Hungarian variety. Leaves were softened in boiling water, then filled with a mixture of rice, ground beef stretched with bread, garlic, parsley, and grated cheese. The rolls were braised in tomato sauce for an hour and a half until everything melted together. A pinch of basil and a squeeze of lemon at the end brightened the whole pot. Served with crusty bread, this was Sunday dinner for 10 people for under $1. The cabbage absorbed the tomato sauce. The filling stayed moist from the rice. The whole meal tasted like a celebration. Italian families from Calabria made this regularly. Most Italian Americans today have never tasted it. It vanished from kitchens when frozen meals took over. The technique was meditative. Italian mothers stood at the stove on Sunday morning, dropping cabbage leaves one at a time into boiling water for 30 seconds, then fishing them out with tongs and laying them flat on towels to drain. Once a dozen or 2 leaves had been softened, the filling was spooned onto each one, the sides folded in, and the leaf rolled tight into a small green package. The rolls were arranged in a deep pot, packed close together so they would hold their shape during cooking. Tomato sauce was poured over the top, enough to cover the rolls by an inch. The pot went on the stove at low heat and simmered slowly for an hour and a half. The smell that filled the kitchen during that time was unforgettable. Cabbage and tomato and meat and garlic mingled into something that promised an entire afternoon of comfort. When the rolls finally came out of the pot, the cabbage had turned tender and translucent, and the filling inside had set into a savory, rice-rich heart. Each roll was a meal in itself. Italian-American grandmothers in Brooklyn and the Bronx, particularly those whose families came from Calabria and the deep south of Italy, made stuffed cabbage at least once a month through the cold seasons. It was a dish designed for winter, when cabbage was abundant and cheap, and the long simmer warmed the whole apartment. The lemon at the end was the Italian touch that distinguished this version from Eastern European stuffed cabbage. The brightness cut through the heavy tomato and meat. The basil added freshness. The whole pot tasted like Italy filtered through an immigrant kitchen, transformed by what was available at the corner market in post-war Brooklyn. Third pattern. Break. Here is the part nobody wants to admit. The Italian-American Sunday dinner you remember from your childhood, the one with 7 courses and 3 meats and a sauce that simmered all day, was the celebration version of these meals, the promotion, the graduation, the thing that happened twice a year for 3 generations and was filmed into the family mythology. The actual Sunday dinner of an Italian-American family in 1953 looked like this list: a pot of beans, a pan of greens, a handful of pasta, bread and oil, sometimes a chicken, once a month a piece of beef. Italian writers romanticize the Sunday table, but the truth is that table was built on these humble dishes 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year. The big celebration only existed because the small everyday meal kept the family alive long enough to celebrate at all. The Italian-American writer who recalls the Sunday gravy of his childhood is often remembering the once-a-year version, the holiday meal that stuck in his mind because it was so different from the everyday. The everyday was beans and bread. The everyday was leftover pasta turned into a frittata. The everyday was a can of tomatoes stretched over a pound of pasta with breadcrumbs on top. That everyday is what we should be remembering, not because it was poor, but because it was real. The mothers who made those meals were not failing to make the celebration meal. They were succeeding at making a meal at all, every day, for years, on almost no money. That was the actual achievement. The braciole and the lasagna were just the occasional flourish at the end of 100 quiet Sunday suppers of escarole and beans. Number 5. Meatballs stretched with bread. Real Italian-American meatballs were not 80% meat. They were 40% meat and 60% everything else. Day-old bread soaked in milk was the soul of the recipe. Garlic, parsley, grated cheese, 2 eggs, and just enough ground beef to bind it all together. The bread did not just stretch the meat, it made the meatballs tender. A meatball without bread is a hockey puck. A meatball with bread soaked in milk is a cloud. Italian mothers made 20 meatballs from a single pound of ground beef this way, feeding a family for 2 meals. They simmered in tomato sauce for 2 hours, absorbing flavor and releasing flavor back into the pot. The sauce that resulted was richer than anything that came from a jar. Modern Italian Americans use less bread and more meat, and the meatballs are heavier and worse for it. The bread was not a compromise, it was the secret. The soaking process was specific. The bread had to be at least a day old ideally 2 or 3 days. Fresh bread was too soft and would turn the filling gummy. Stale bread absorbed the milk slowly and broke down into something that distributed evenly through the meat. Italian mothers tore the bread into rough pieces and dropped them into a bowl of milk, pressing down on them until they were saturated. After 10 minutes, the bread was the consistency of wet sand, holding its shape but ready to be incorporated into the meat mixture. When everything was mixed together, the texture was loose and soft, almost too wet to hold its shape. That was the point. Italian mothers shaped each meatball with damp hands, working quickly so the mixture would not stick. The meatballs came out the size of a golf ball, not the size of a baseball that you see in American restaurants today. The smaller size meant more surface area for browning, faster cooking, and more meatballs per pound of meat. After browning briefly in olive oil to develop a crust, the meatballs went directly into the tomato sauce to finish cooking. 2 hours in the sauce was the rule. During that time, the meatballs absorbed sauce and released their own juices back into the pot, creating a flavor exchange that enriched both the meat and the sauce. The bread inside each meatball soaked up the sauce flavors, becoming infused with garlic and tomato. By the time the meatballs were served over pasta on Sunday afternoon, they were tender enough to cut with a fork, light enough to feel almost weightless, rich enough to satisfy a hungry working man. The pound of beef that started the recipe had been transformed into 20 distinct meatballs, enough for 2 meals and leftovers. That was the magic of bread in Italian-American cooking. It multiplied, it stretched, it transformed cheap ingredients into something that tasted like luxury. Number 4, pasta aglio e olio, the most honest meal in the Italian repertoire. A pound of spaghetti, 6 cloves of garlic, half a cup of olive oil, a pinch of red pepper flakes, salt. That is the entire recipe. The garlic was sliced thin and slowly toasted in olive oil over low heat until it turned golden but never brown. The pasta was cooked al dente in heavily salted water. The two were combined in the pan with a splash of pasta water to emulsify the oil into a silky sauce that coated every strand. A handful of parsley, if you had it. A grating of cheese, if you were feeling rich. This dish cost 15 cents and took 12 minutes. Italian working men ate it on Sundays after midnight mass, when they were too tired to cook anything else. It tasted like a feast. Modern chefs charge $28 for it. Your grandmother knew it was always a poor man's meal, pretending to be elegant. The technique was unforgiving. The garlic had to be sliced paper thin, almost translucent. Italian mothers used a sharp knife and worked slowly, knowing that uneven slices would cook unevenly and ruin the dish. The slices went into cold olive oil, then the heat was turned to low. Slowly, the oil warmed and the garlic began to sizzle gently. The trick was to keep the heat low enough that the garlic toasted without browning. Browned garlic turned bitter and made the whole dish unpleasant. Golden garlic was perfect, sweet and nutty, with all its harshness mellowed out. The red pepper flakes went in once the garlic had reached the right color, infusing the oil with a gentle warmth. The pasta water, salty and starchy from cooking the spaghetti, was the secret to the sauce. A ladleful added to the garlicky oil created an emulsion, the starch binding the oil and water into a glossy sauce that coated every strand of pasta. Italian-American working men, coming home from late shifts or returning from midnight mass on Sunday morning, could make this dish in less time than it took to set the table. The result tasted nothing like a desperation meal. It tasted like something a chef in Rome would serve. The simplicity was deceiving. With so few ingredients, every element had to be perfect. The garlic perfectly toasted, the pasta perfectly al dente, the oil and water perfectly emulsified. When all those elements came together, The dish transcended its humble origins. A pound of spaghetti, 15 cents of supporting ingredients, 12 minutes of effort, and you had a meal that fed 6 people in a way that felt almost ceremonial. 5:20 p.m. Number 3, Sunday gravy with breadcrumbs. This is the dish where breadcrumbs, the ingredient that cost less than a nickel, built more Italian-American families than any pasta company ever sold. The Sunday gravy of post-war Italian families was not the meat festival people remember. It was a pot of tomatoes simmered for 4 hours with a single bone, often a neck bone or a piece of pork rib that cost 20 cents. The bone gave the sauce body and depth. Breadcrumbs were stirred into the sauce in the last hour to thicken it. Italian mothers from Calabria swore by this method. The sauce became dense, rich, almost meaty in texture, even though there was barely any meat in the pot. Served over a pound of pasta, this fed a family of 8 for less than 50 cents. Calabrian and Lucanian peasants had been thickening their tomato sauces with breadcrumbs for centuries before they ever boarded ships for America. The technique worked through simple chemistry. Breadcrumbs absorbed liquid and released starch, transforming a thin, watery sauce into something thick and clinging. The bread also added a subtle, savory depth that made the sauce taste richer than its ingredients should have allowed. The version with multiple meats, the one that became the Italian-American legend, was reserved for special occasions. The everyday version was the bone and breadcrumb version, and it fed millions of working-class Italian-American families through years of struggle. A generation of Italian-Americans has grown up never tasting their grandmother's real Sunday gravy. Number 2, pizza fritta. When mothers had extra dough from baking bread, they did not throw it out. They rolled it thin, fried it in a pan with olive oil, and turned it into pizza fritta. The fried dough puffed up golden and crisp, then was topped with a smear of tomato sauce, a sprinkle of cheese, and maybe a basil leaf. That was Sunday dinner. The whole meal cost less than 10 cents per person and felt like a celebration. Italian-American children in Newark and Trenton remember pizza fritta as one of the best meals of their childhood. The dough was stretched thin by hand, almost to the point of transparency in places. The frying happened in a wide pan of hot olive oil. When the dough hit the oil, it ballooned up immediately, puffing into a golden disc that crisped on the outside and stayed tender on the inside. The whole frying took less than 2 minutes. The disc came out of the oil onto paper towels to drain, and then it was topped while still hot. The result was simple, inexpensive, and utterly delicious. Italian-American children ate pizza fritta with their hands, the hot dough almost too hot to hold, the cheese stretching in strings, the sauce dripping down their chins. The dish was never planned in advance. It was always a happy accident, a way to use up something that would have otherwise gone to waste. Modern pizza chains and frozen pizzas cannot touch what pizza fritta was. Number 1, pasta of fagioli. At the top of this list sits the meal so simple, so cheap, and so completely satisfying that Italian grandmothers across the Bronx, Hoboken, and South Philadelphia served it more often than spaghetti and meatballs. A pound of dried cannellini or borlotti beans soaked overnight, an onion, 2 cloves of garlic, a can of crushed tomatoes, a piece of pancetta or salt pork the size of a thumb. Everything simmered for 3 hours until the beans broke down and thickened the broth. Then a cup of ditalini or broken spaghetti was dropped in and cooked until tender. A grating of pecorino on top, a drizzle of olive oil, a crank of black pepper. That was Sunday dinner. The whole pot cost less than 50 cents in 1954 and fed 10 people. Pasta e fagioli is the meal that built Italian America. It crossed every region, every dialect, every village. Sicilians made it. Neapolitans made it. Calabrians made it. Every Italian immigrant family in every American city made some version, and it never stopped being made through the war years, the Depression, and the post-war years when families finally had enough money to buy real meat. They kept making pasta e fagioli anyway because it tasted like home. The 3-hour simmer was not negotiable. The beans had to break down partially, releasing their starch into the broth and thickening it into something between a soup and a stew. The pasta was always broken, never long. Italian families saved their broken pasta scraps in jars specifically for this dish. The pot sat on the back of the stove on Sunday morning, simmering quietly while the family went to Mass. When they returned, the apartment smelled like the old country. Pasta e fagioli was not a meal you made when you were too poor to make something better. It was a meal you made because nothing better existed. And we have forgotten how to make it. Here is my challenge. Make one of these this week: pasta e piselli, escarole and beans, or pancotto with garlic and bread. Then sit at the table with whoever is left in your family and eat it slow. Because these were not just dinners. They were the meals that turned Italian peasants into Italian Americans, that fed children who grew up to build half this country. Share which one you are going to try in the comments. I want to know if pasta e fagioli gets more love than the stuffed artichokes. Because these are not just recipes, they are proof that the simplest food, made with care, eaten with people you love, can still be the best meal of the week.